when the Steel Wolves motorcycle gang decided to extort money from vendors at Pine Valley's farmers market. They thought the overweight farmer with his produce stand would be their easiest target. They couldn't have known that Dan Harrison had spent 15 years commanding Delta Force's most classified missions before trading his tactical gear for overalls and a quiet life among the tomato plants. The extra weight wasn't a disguise. It was just what happened when a warrior found peace in growing things instead of destroying them. But when Tyler Grizz McCall and his gang threatened the community Dan had come to love, they would learn that the most dangerous predator isn't always the one that shows its teeth. Their campaign of intimidation would accidentally expose a criminal empire spanning 3 states, proving that sometimes the deadliest force in the room is the quiet farmer who spent years trying very hard not to be deadly at all. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The sun hadn't quite cleared the horizon when Dan's old pickup truck rumbled into the farmer's market, its bed laden with wooden crates of fresh produce. The market was just stirring to life, vendors setting up their stalls in the cool morning air, the smell of fresh coffee wafting from Sarah's coffee cart. Dan's constant companion, a golden retriever named Bear, sat alertly in the passenger seat, his graying muzzle betraying his age. Another day, another dollar. Boy. Dan patted Bear's head, earning a tail wag that made the whole truck shake. At 52, Dan carried his considerable bulk with surprising grace as he stepped down from the driver's seat. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel one last time before he pushed himself out, his knees creaking in protest. Bear jumped down after him, maintaining a protective stance as Dan began unloading crates of tomatoes, lettuce, and summer squash. The morning regulars couldn't help but smile at the sight of the big man and his faithful dog. There was something endearing about watching such a large man handle vegetables with the gentleness of someone arranging flowers. "Morning, Dan," called out Martha from the honey stall. "Those tomatoes looking as sweet as ever." Dan nodded, offering a small wave. "Best batch yet, Martha. Save you a few heirlooms. The purple ones you like." His responses were always like that, kind but brief, as if he was carefully measuring out his words like ingredients in a recipe. The vendors had grown used to his reserved nature over the 3 years he'd been selling at the market. Some had initially mistaken his quietness for aloofness, but they'd learned that Dan's actions spoke louder than his words. The market slowly filled with the usual morning bustle, the clinking of coffee cups, the shuffle of feet, the murmur of conversation. Dan methodically arranged his produce, each vegetable placed with care, while Bear maintained his post, occasionally accepting gentle pats from regular customers. "Uncle Dan, Uncle Dan." A high-pitched voice cut through the morning sounds. 8-year-old Lily Thompson came bouncing down the aisle between the stalls, her dark braids swinging, clutching a small paper bag in her hands. She was the daughter of Marie Thompson, who ran the flower stall 3 spots down. Dan's face softened into a genuine smile. "Well, if it isn't my favorite market helper. What have you got there, Lily?" "Mom helped me bake cookies last night." Lily thrust the bag toward him proudly. "Chocolate chip, your favorite. Bear can have one too. They're not raisin ones this time, I promise." Dan accepted the bag with exaggerated ceremony. "Why, thank you, Miss Lily. This'll make my morning extra special." He carefully broke a cookie in half, sharing it with Bear, who took it with theatrical gentleness that made Lily giggle. What the other vendors didn't know was that Dan had been quietly helping the Thompson family since Marie's husband passed away last winter. A mysterious envelope would appear at their door whenever the bills got tight, and their garden somehow produced twice as much since Dan started dropping by to give casual advice. "Mom says the zinnias are extra pretty this year because of your special soil mix," Lily chatted, perched on an empty crate while Dan worked. "Will you teach me how to grow big sunflowers like yours?" "Tell you what," Dan replied, adjusting a display of bell peppers. "Come by the farm next weekend, and we'll plant some seeds. They'll be taller than you by summer's end." A new face appeared at the stall, a young man in his early 30s, looking somewhat out of place in pressed khakis and a polo shirt. "Excuse me," he said, studying the vegetables with obvious uncertainty. "I'm Greg Mitchell, just moved in on Oak Street. Trying my hand at growing my own vegetables, but I'm afraid I'm killing more plants than I'm growing." Dan straightened up, wiping his hands on his well-worn jeans. Pleasure to meet you, Greg. What seems to be the trouble? Everything. Greg laughed nervously. The tomatoes are wilting, the cucumbers are yellow, and I'm pretty sure my lettuce is plotting revenge. Dan's deep chuckle surprised even himself. Sounds like you might be loving them a little too much. Most common mistake is overwatering. Tell you what. He reached into a crate and pulled out a handful of healthy tomato plants he'd been nurturing. These are ready for transplant. Let me show you how to get them started right. For the next 15 minutes, Dan patiently explained proper planting depth, watering schedules, and the importance of good drainage. Greg took notes on his phone, nodding eagerly. A distant rumble of motorcycles caught Dan's attention mid-sentence. The sound echoed off the mountains, carrying down into the valley where the market sat. Bear's ears perked up, but Dan gave him a reassuring pat. Just tourists heading to the lake, he said, more to himself than to Greg. Gets busy this time of year. The morning progressed steadily. Regular customers came and went, many stopping to chat with Bear, while Dan quietly rang up their purchases. Around mid-morning, Joe Bradley from the butcher's stall wandered over, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Hey, Dan," Joe called out, loud enough for nearby vendors to hear. "I've been meaning to ask, how does a man your size stay so big eating all these vegetables?" The market went quietly tense, but Dan just let out a hearty laugh. "Well, Joe, I'll tell you my secret." He leaned in conspiratorially. "I eat all the ugly vegetables that don't sell. Can't let anything go to waste on a farm." The tension broke as everyone chuckled, and Joe shook his head admiringly. "You're a good sport, Dan. Trade you some of those ugly vegetables for some prime cuts next week." By early afternoon, most of Dan's produce had found homes in various kitchen baskets around town. He packed up the remaining vegetables, some set aside for the local food bank, and climbed back into his truck with Bear. The drive home took them past rolling hills and open fields, the late spring sun painting everything in warm hues. Dan drove slowly, one arm resting on the open window, taking in the sight of his farm as it came into view. The neat rows of vegetables stretched out like soldiers on parade, the old red barn standing guard over them. It wasn't much compared to some of the bigger operations in the valley, but it was his piece of peace. He parked in front of the modest farmhouse, its white paint slightly faded but clean. Bear jumped out and made his usual patrol of the property, while Dan unloaded the truck. Inside, the house was simple but tidy, with worn but comfortable furniture and windows that let in plenty of light. As he went through his evening routine, feeding Bear, making a simple dinner, checking the weather forecast for tomorrow, Dan's eyes kept drifting to the hallway. Finally, after the dishes were done and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, he walked down the hall to his study. The room was small, mostly filled with books about farming and a desk covered in seed catalogs. But on the wall hung a dusty photograph in a simple frame. Dan stood before it, his large frame casting a shadow in the fading light. The photo showed a group of men in combat gear, their faces young and serious. Dan was there in the center, nearly unrecognizable, younger, harder, his body lean and coiled like a spring. They stood in front of a helicopter, the Afghan mountains rising behind them. The Delta Force insignia was clearly visible on their uniforms. A familiar ache spread through Dan's chest as he looked at the faces of his old team. Some of those men were no longer alive, their stories ending in distant places with unpronounceable names. He reached up and touched the frame gently, then turned away. At his desk, Dan pulled out a worn leather journal. Writing had become a nightly ritual, a way to keep the memories from becoming too loud. His large hands, more used to handling tools than pens, moved carefully across the page. Market was good today. Lily brought cookies again. That kid has more light in her than the sun itself. Reminded me of Sophie at that age. Greg Mitchell moved in. Seems like a good kid, eager to learn. Heard motorcycles in the distance. For a moment, I was back there, hearing the choppers coming in hot. But Bear brought me back. He always does. Sometimes I wonder if they'd recognize me now, the old team, the farmer with the big belly and the quiet voice. Sometimes I barely recognize myself. But maybe that's okay. Maybe that's what healing looks like. He closed the journal and got ready for bed, but sleep didn't come easily. It never did. In the darkness, fragments of memories played behind his closed eyes. The sound of gunfire, the weight of a wounded teammate across his shoulders, the metallic taste of fear in his mouth. Bear, sensing his distress, climbed onto the bed, against the rules, but Dan never enforced them at night, and pressed his warm body against Dan's side. "We're okay, boy," Dan whispered, running his hand through Bear's fur. "We're okay." But in his dreams, Dan was running through narrow streets, the sound of explosions getting closer. His team was scattered, communications were down, and somewhere in the darkness, a voice was calling his name. "Commander! Commander!" The voice grew more desperate, but no matter how fast he ran, he couldn't reach them in time. He woke with a start, his t-shirt damp with sweat, Bear's concerned face inches from his own. The digital clock read 3:17 a.m. Outside, crickets chirped peacefully, and a cool breeze carried the smell of his vegetable garden through the open window. Dan took a deep breath, grounding himself in the present moment. He was here, on his farm, far from those distant battlefields. He was Dan the farmer now, not Commander Daniel Harrison of the Delta Force. The market would open in a few hours. There were vegetables to harvest, customers to serve, and a little girl who believed her Uncle Dan could grow sunflowers as tall as the sky. He lay back down, Bear settling beside him with a contented sigh. Tomorrow would be another quiet day in his quiet life. That's all it needed to be. But somewhere in the distance, a motorcycle engine roared through the night, and even in his sleep, Dan's hands tightened into fists. The next morning dawned with an unsettling change in the air. As Dan's pickup approached the farmer's market, the usual peaceful morning symphony was shattered by the aggressive rumble of motorcycle engines. Bear, sitting in his usual spot, let out a low growl. "Easy, boy," Dan murmured, though his own muscles had tensed at the sight before him. Half a dozen motorcycles were parked haphazardly across the market's entrance, their chrome gleaming aggressively in the morning sun. They took up multiple parking spaces, forcing other vendors to leave their vehicles far from their stalls. Dan parked his truck at his usual spot, though it took some maneuvering to avoid the motorcycles. As he started unloading his produce, he could hear raised voices from inside the market. Bear stayed closer than usual, his normally relaxed demeanor replaced with watchful alertness. The source of the disturbance soon became clear. A group of bikers, their leather vests adorned with patches declaring them members of the Steel Wolves, were making their way through the market like they owned it. Their leader, a tall man with a graying beard and cold eyes, swaggered at the front of the pack. "Now, that's not what I'd call a friendly price," the leader's voice carried across the market as he loomed over Martha's honey stand. "Sweet lady like you should be more accommodating to new customers." Martha, usually so confident, seemed to shrink behind her display of mason jars. "The prices are fair, sir. I can't go any lower." "Name's Tyler Grizz McCall," the leader drawled, picking up a jar and examining it with exaggerated care. "And where I come from, businesses show proper respect to the Steel Wolves. Ain't that right, boys?" His companions laughed, the sound as harsh as motorcycle exhaust. One of them, a younger man with a snake tattoo coiling up his neck, knocked over a jar accidentally. The honey spread across the ground like spilled sunlight. "Oops," Snake Tattoo grinned. "Guess you'll have to discount that one." Dan continued setting up his stall, his movements deliberate and calm, but his eyes never stopped tracking the group's progress through the market. He watched as they moved from stall to stall, their pattern becoming clear, intimidation wrapped in the thin veneer of customer service. They reached old Mr. Chen's vegetable stand, 2 stalls down from Dan's. The elderly man had been selling his specialty Asian vegetables at the market for over 2 decades. Today, his carefully arranged display of bok choy and daikon radishes caught Tyler's attention. "What kind of weird stuff you selling here, old man?" Tyler picked up a bitter melon, tossing it carelessly from hand to hand. "Don't look like American vegetables to me." "Traditional Chinese vegetables," Mr. Chen explained quietly. "Very healthy, very fresh." "Fresh?" Another biker, this one with a skull bandana, snorted. "Looks like something that died in the sun." With a sudden movement, he swept his arm across the display, sending vegetables rolling across the ground. Mr. Chen's protests were drowned out by their laughter. Dan's hands tightened on the crate he was holding, his knuckles turning white. Bear sensed his tension and moved closer, but Dan forced himself to stay still, to keep arranging his tomatoes as if he hadn't noticed the chaos unfolding nearby. The strategy worked until Snake Tattoo broke away from the group and approached Dan's stall. He picked up a shiny red apple, taking a large, deliberate bite without asking. "Hey, Farmer Fatty," he called out, juice running down his chin. "How much you want for this apple? Though looks like you've been eating too many of your own products." He patted his stomach mockingly. Dan set down his crate and turned to face the biker. His voice remained level, almost gentle. "That'll be $2 for the apple." Snake Tattoo's face twisted with anger at Dan's calm response. $2? For one apple? You trying to rob me, fat man? Regular price, Dan replied simply. Same for everyone. Tyler McCall had noticed the exchange and sauntered over, his boots crunching over scattered vegetables. "You got a problem with my friend here. What's your name, farmer?" "Dan." "And no problem at all. Just asking for payment for goods received." Tyler's eyes narrowed at Dan's continued composure. "Well, Dan, seems to me you need to learn about customer relations. Maybe know your place in the new order of things around here." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife when a small voice suddenly piped up. "Uncle Dan, I brought you more cook." Lily's cheerful greeting cut off in a frightened squeak as she accidentally bumped into one of the bikers, her basket of cookies tumbling to the ground. The biker, a muscular man with a braided beard, turned toward her with an annoyed growl. "Watch where you're going, Brad." He kicked his motorcycle starter, and the engine roared to life right next to Lily. The little girl screamed and fell backward, cookies scattering across the pavement. Dan moved with surprising speed for a man his size, placing himself between Lily and the biker. His voice remained calm, but there was something in it now, a subtle edge that made several of the bikers shift uncomfortably. "The young lady was just bringing me my breakfast," Dan said, helping Lily to her feet. "No harm done. Right, Lily?" Lily nodded, pressing close to Dan's side. Bear moved to her other side, his presence protective rather than threatening. "Ain't you sweet?" Tyler sneered, stepping closer to Dan. "Playing guardian angel to little girls. But who's going to protect you, big man?" Dan didn't move, didn't flinch as Tyler invaded his personal space. "Nobody needs protection here. This is a peaceful market. Always has been." "Peace is overrated," Tyler said, and suddenly shoved Dan hard in the chest. The push would have sent most men stumbling, but Dan merely rocked slightly on his feet, as immovable as an old oak tree. The biker's confusion at Dan's stability was apparent, but Tyler pushed again, harder. Still, Dan didn't retaliate, didn't even raise his hands in defense. He just stood there, solid as a mountain, his eyes never leaving Tyler's face. "Uncle Dan," Lily's voice quavered. "I'm scared." "Nothing to be scared of, sweetheart," Dan replied, his voice gentle despite the tension. "Why don't you go help your mom with the flowers? Bear will go with you." The dog immediately understood, gently herding Lily away from the confrontation. The girl clutched Bear's collar as they retreated, looking back worriedly at Dan. "You're either brave or stupid, fat man," Tyler growled, frustrated by Dan's lack of reaction. "Maybe both." "Hey." A new voice joined the fray. Greg Mitchell pushed through the gathering crowd, his face flushed with anger. "Leave him alone. He's done nothing to you." Tyler's gang immediately surrounded Greg, their faces promising violence. The young man's courage wavered, but didn't break as he stood his ground. Well, Tyler drawled. "Looks like Fatty's got himself a defender. You want to stand up for him, boy? Maybe take his place?" The bikers closed in on Greg, their intentions clear in their clenched fists and cruel smiles. But before things could escalate further, Dan's voice cut through the tension like a knife through butter. "Greg," just one word, but something in Dan's tone made everyone freeze. "Would you mind checking on Mr. Chin? I think he could use some help picking up his vegetables." There was authority in that voice, the kind that expected immediate obedience. Greg found himself moving before he even realized it, the bikers parting automatically to let him pass. Tyler blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by the subtle shift in power. He recovered quickly, but something had changed in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty, quickly masked by bravado. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Tyler spat, playing it cool, acting all peaceful. "But we'll see how long that lasts. This market, it's going to learn some new rules." And you? He jabbed a finger into Dan's chest. You're going to learn them the hard way. He turned to his gang, jerking his head toward the exit. Let's roll, boys. We got what we came for today. The bikers mounted their motorcycles, engines roaring to life in a cacophony of mechanical anger. As they prepared to leave, Tyler called out over the noise. See you soon, Farmer Fatty. Better start practicing your customer service. Their laughter mixed with the sound of engines as they peeled out of the parking lot, leaving behind scattered vegetables, spilled honey, and a heavy silence. The market slowly came back to life as vendors emerged from their stalls. Martha hurried over to Dan, wringing her hands. Oh, Dan, thank goodness you kept your cool, she said. I was so worried they were going to hurt someone. Those types always want a reaction, Dan replied, already bending down to help clean up the mess. Best not to give them one. Greg joined them, carrying an armful of rescued bok choy. That was incredible, Dan, the way you handled them. But aren't you worried they'll come back? Dan straightened up, surveying the damage to the market. Vendors were helping each other clean up, the community already pulling together in the face of adversity. Lily had returned with Bear and was helping Mr. Chen arrange his vegetables back on his stand. They'll be back, Dan said quietly. People like that always come back. Then we should call the police. Greg insisted. Dan shook his head. They haven't done enough for the police to do much yet. Besides, they're counting on fear doing their work for them. Best thing we can do is stay calm and stay together. But as he spoke, his eyes tracked the direction the bikers had gone, his farmer's hands unconsciously curling into fighters' fists. The peaceful morning had shattered like Martha's honey jar, and deep inside, in a place he kept carefully locked away, old instincts were stirring. The market gradually returned to its normal rhythm, but something had changed. Conversations were quieter, glances were thrown more frequently toward the entrance, and everyone gave Dan's stall a wider berth. Not out of fear, but out of a new kind of respect. They'd seen something in him today, just a glimpse of something solid and unmovable beneath his gentle exterior. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Dan went about his business as usual, selling vegetables, offering growing advice, sharing quiet words of encouragement with shaken vendors. But his eyes never stopped scanning the entrance. His ears never stopped listening for the rumble of motorcycles. Bear returned to his post by Dan's side, occasionally growling softly at the lingering smell of leather and motorcycle exhaust. Dan scratched behind his ears, his touch gentle, but his voice carrying a weight it hadn't held in years. I know, boy, he murmured. I know they're coming back. But this time, we'll be ready. The market would never be quite the same after that morning. The peace had been broken, and in its place, a current of tension ran beneath the surface of everyday life. But as Dan watched Lily helping Mr. Chen arrange his vegetables with extra care, saw Martha offering free coffee to rattled vendors, noticed Greg staying late to help clean up, he realized that sometimes trouble didn't just bring chaos. Sometimes it brought people together. And sometimes, it woke up parts of yourself you thought you'd left behind forever. The afternoon sun was dipping behind the mountains when Dan's truck turned onto the gravel road leading to his farm. Bear, who had been dozing in the passenger seat, suddenly sat up straight, his hackles rising. Dan noticed it too. Something was wrong with the familiar landscape ahead. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as he approached his property. The wooden fence that had stood for years, the one he'd repainted just last spring, lay broken in several places. Pieces of wood scattered across the ground like fallen soldiers. But that wasn't the worst of it. The old red barn, which had always stood proud against the sky, now bore a different kind of mark. Crude letters had been spray-painted across its broad side in angry black paint. Fat Farmer, stretched 20 feet wide, the paint still wet enough to drip. Dan sat in his truck for a long moment, taking in the damage. Bear whined softly beside him, picking up on his master's tension. Finally, Dan reached over and scratched behind the dog's ears. Well, boy, he said quietly, looks like we've got some work to do. He stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching on the gravel. The evening air was still warm, heavy with the scent of his tomato plants and fresh-cut hay. And now, the sharp chemical smell of spray paint. As he surveyed the damage up close, he noticed empty beer cans scattered around, motorcycle tracks carved into his carefully tended lawn. Without a word, Dan walked to his tool shed and began gathering what he'd need: hammer, nails, spare boards he kept for fence repair. The familiar weight of the tools in his hands was comforting, grounding. He'd built this life board by board, nail by nail. He could rebuild it the same way. As the sun sank lower, Dan worked steadily, methodically replacing broken fence posts and reattaching rails. Bear patrolled the perimeter, occasionally bringing back beer cans in his mouth, which Dan collected in a bucket. The physical labor was good, keeping his hands busy while his mind wandered to places he usually avoided. The rhythmic pounding of the hammer took him back, way back, to another time when things had fallen apart. Kandahar Province, 2008. The helicopter blades chopped through the hot Afghan air, carrying Dan and his Delta Force team toward their target. He was younger then, leaner, his face hard with responsibility as he briefed his men one last time. "Intel says the compound is lightly guarded," he told them, having to shout over the rotor noise. "In and out, clean extraction of the asset." Questions? Sergeant Mike Whiskey Wilson, Dan's second in command, spoke up. "Intel's been sketchy lately, Commander. You sure about this one?" Dan nodded, but something in his gut twisted uncomfortably. The intel had come through unusual channels, but orders were orders. "We stick to the plan. Team 1 takes the north entrance. Team 2 covers the south. Watch your corners. Watch each other's backs." They dropped into hell. The lightly guarded compound was a fortress. The moment they touched down, heavy fire erupted from multiple positions. They'd been expected. "It's a trap," Dan shouted into his radio. "Fall back! Fall back!" But it was too late. The night lit up with muzzle flashes and explosions. Dan watched in horror as Team 2's position was hit by an RPG. The screams of his men mixed with the thunder of gunfire. The sharp crack of a board breaking under too much pressure snapped Dan back to the present. He'd been gripping the fence post so hard it had splintered in his hands. Bear was at his side instantly, pressing against his leg, grounding him in the now. "I'm okay, boy," Dan murmured, his voice rough. He looked down at his hands. They were trembling slightly. Contractor's hands now, not a soldier's, with dirt under the nails instead of gun oil. But they remembered. They remembered everything. The sound of tires on gravel made him turn. A small blue sedan was coming up his driveway, Marie Thompson's car. Lily's mother stepped out, her face drawn with concern. "Dan," she called out, hurrying over. "I just heard about what happened at the market this morning. The whole town's talking about it." She stopped, taking in the graffiti on the barn. "Oh my God, they did this too?" "It's nothing, Marie," Dan said, turning back to his fence repair. "Just some kids acting tough." "Nothing?" "Dan, these aren't kids. These are dangerous men." Marie moved closer, lowering her voice. "Listen, Tom Rodriguez down at the hardware store, he's organizing some of the men. They're talking about standing up to these bikers. We could help." "No." Dan's voice was firm but gentle. "That's exactly what they want, an excuse to escalate. I can handle this, but—" "How's Lily?" Dan interrupted, deliberately changing the subject. "She was pretty scared this morning." Marie's expression softened. "She's okay. Actually, she wanted to come thank you, but I thought, with everything—" She gestured at the vandalism. "Bring her by tomorrow," Dan said, managing a smile. "Those sunflower seeds won't plant themselves." After Marie left, Dan worked until darkness made it impossible to continue. The fence was mostly repaired, though the graffiti would have to wait for morning. He fed Bear, made himself a simple dinner, and tried to settle into his evening routine. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his men falling in that ambush, heard their screams mixing with the memory of motorcycle engines. The next morning dawned cold and gray, matching Dan's mood as he drove to the market. Bear seemed extra alert in the passenger seat, his eyes constantly scanning the road. They were earlier than usual, hoping to get set up before any trouble started. But trouble, it seemed, was an early riser too. The roar of motorcycles filled the air, just as Dan was finishing his display. This time, there were more of them, at least a dozen bikes roaring into the parking lot, Tyler Grizz McCall leading the pack. They didn't bother parking properly, just left their bikes running, filling the morning air with exhaust and menace. "Good morning, market folks." Tyler's voice boomed across the stalls. "Hope everyone's feeling generous today. What happened next was like watching a wave of destruction roll through the market. The bikers moved as a group, taking whatever they wanted, knocking over displays that displeased them. They were bolder than before, openly stuffing products into their jackets, daring anyone to object. Dan watched, his body absolutely still, as they ransacked Martha's honey stand, pocketed old Mr. Chin's cash box, and helped themselves to fresh bread from the baker's stall. Bear growled low beside him, but Dan kept a steady hand on his collar. Then Greg Mitchell did something both brave and foolish. "Stop it," he shouted, stepping into Tyler's path as the biker leader was about to knock over Marie's flower display. "You can't just take what you want." Tyler's face split into a cruel grin. "Look who's growing a spine, boys. The farmer's little friend wants to play hero." Two bikers grabbed Greg's arms while a third, Snake Tattoo from yesterday, drove a fist into his stomach. Greg doubled over, gasping for air. They didn't see Dan move. One moment he was behind his stall, the next he was just there. His hand caught Snake Tattoo's wrist before another punch could land. And then something happened that nobody quite saw but everyone felt. There was a slight twist, a subtle shift of weight, and suddenly Snake Tattoo was on the ground, clutching his arm and howling in pain. The two bikers holding Greg let go and rushed Dan. Again, there was no dramatic movement, no theatrical display. Dan simply seemed to guide their momentum, adding little touches here and there, like a farmer steering water down a furrow. One biker flew into a stack of empty crates. The other found himself sitting down hard, wondering how he'd gotten there. The market had gone absolutely silent except for the idling motorcycles and Snake Tattoo's whimpers. Everyone stared at Dan, who stood exactly as he always did, relaxed, slightly stooped, looking more like someone's kindly uncle than whatever he'd just shown himself to be. Tyler's face had gone from shocked to furious. He strode forward until he was nose to nose with Dan. "You just made the biggest mistake of your fat life," he snarled, then spat directly in Dan's face. "You're dead. You hear me? Dead." Dan didn't wipe the spit away, didn't move at all. He just looked at Tyler with eyes that had suddenly gone cold and distant, like he was seeing something far away, or perhaps remembering it. "Take your men and go," Dan said quietly. "While you can." Something in his voice, in his eyes, made Tyler step back. He covered his uncertainty with a harsh laugh. "This isn't over, farmer. Not by a long shot." He turned to his gang, most of whom were picking themselves up or helping Snake Tattoo to his feet. "Mount up. We're going to show this town what happens when they resist the steel wolves." The bikers roared away, their exit as noisy as their entrance. In their wake, the market was left in stunned silence. Dan calmly walked to his truck, got a rag, and wiped his face. When he turned back, he found everyone staring at him. Martha was the first to speak. "Dan, what? How did you?" "Just some old self-defense classes," Dan said, already moving to help Greg to his feet. "You okay, son?" Greg nodded, wincing slightly. "That was incredible. Where did you learn to?" "Best get some ice on that stomach," Dan interrupted. "Marie, you have any ice packs in your cooler?" But the questions didn't stop. All morning, as the market tried to return to normal, people kept glancing at Dan, whispering among themselves. He could hear snippets of conversations. "Did you see how fast he moved? Those weren't self-defense moves. My brother was in the military, and he said..." Dan ignored it all, focusing on helping clean up the mess, straightening displays, checking on vendors who'd been robbed. But he could feel their eyes on him, could sense them reconsidering everything they thought they knew about the quiet farmer who'd lived among them for 3 years. That evening, after a long day of avoiding questions and deflecting concern, Dan sat in his study, staring at the photograph on the wall. The young commander in the picture stared back at him, surrounded by his team, his family. "I'm not that man anymore," he whispered to the photograph. "I can't be." But as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't entirely true. Because when he'd moved to stop those bikers, it hadn't felt like remembering. It had felt like finally stopping pretending to forget. Bear padded into the study and put his head in Dan's lap, sensing his master's turmoil. Dan scratched behind his ears, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the years. "What do you think, boy?" he asked softly. "Can a man change who he is? Or does he just change how much of himself he shows the world?" Bear's only answer was to press closer, offering the unconditional support that had helped Dan through countless nights of memories and regret. Outside, a cool breeze carried the smell of his vegetables, the distant lowing of cattle, the peaceful sounds of the life he'd built. But underneath it all, Dan could hear the rumble of motorcycles in the distance, growing closer with each passing moment. The war he'd tried to leave behind was coming to his doorstep, and this time, he couldn't evacuate. This was home. These were his people. And sometimes, no matter how hard you try to change, circumstances conspire to remind you of exactly who you are. Commander or farmer, soldier or gardener. Maybe the truth was, he'd always been both. And maybe it was time to stop pretending otherwise. In a dimly lit motel room 30 miles outside of town, Tyler Grizz McCall hunched over a laptop, his face illuminated by the screen's blue glow. Empty beer cans and fast food wrappers littered the desk around him. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he'd been at this for hours, maybe days. No way, he muttered, clicking through military records that his less-than-legal contacts had procured. No fucking way. The photos on his screen showed a different Dan Harrison, younger, harder, wearing combat fatigues, and leading men through war-torn streets. Citations, medals, commendations scrolled past Tyler's bloodshot eyes. But it was the designation that made his hands shake. Delta Force Commander. Boss. Snake tattoo called from the other bed, where he was nursing his still sore arm. Find something. Tyler's laugh had an edge of hysteria. Oh, I found something all right. Our fat farmer? He's not just some ex-military grunt. He's goddamn Delta Force. Was their commander for 6 years. The other bikers in the room exchanged uneasy glances. They'd all seen what Dan could do at the market, but this was something else entirely. Maybe we should back off, one suggested. Find easier pickings? Tyler whirled around, his face contorted with rage. Back off? Back off? That fat piece of shit humiliated us. Made us look weak. Nobody does that to the steel wolves, and walks away. He turned back to the laptop, his fingers flying over the keyboard. There's got to be more. Something we can use. Everyone's got a weakness. Meanwhile, across town, Dan's morning routine was interrupted by an unexpected ping from his phone. The number was blocked, but the message made his blood run cold. Watchdog, someone's digging. Your ghost is showing. Watch your 6. R. Dan stared at the message for a long moment. Only a handful of people knew that call sign, and most of them were dead. The fact that Rachel, his former intelligence officer, had broken years of silence to warn him meant trouble was coming. Bear sensed his tension and pressed against his leg. Dan absently scratched the dog's ears while his mind drifted back to another time, another mission. Baghdad, 2007. Watchdog, this is Alpha 1. We're in position. Dan's voice was barely a whisper as he and his team crouched in the shadow of a bombed-out building. The Iraqi summer heat was oppressive, even at night, and sweat trickled down his neck beneath his tactical gear. Copy Alpha 1. Rachel's voice crackled in his earpiece. Intel confirms 6 hostages, basement level. Heavy resistance expected. Dan signaled his team forward. They moved like shadows through the darkened streets, approaching the target building where insurgents held American aid workers captive. The mission was straightforward. Get in, get the hostages, get out. But in war, nothing is ever straightforward. They breached the building perfectly, their coordination flawless after years of working together. The first 2 floors were cleared without a shot fired, and that should have been their first warning. Something's wrong, Mike Whiskey Wilson muttered beside him. This is too easy. They found the hostages exactly where intelligence said they'd be. 6 terrified aid workers, bound but alive. As Dan's team began cutting their restraints, he heard it, a faint beeping. Bomb, he shouted. Everyone out. Now. What followed was chaos. The team rushed the hostages up the stairs as the first explosion rocked the building. But it wasn't just one bomb. The entire structure had been rigged. They were halfway out when the second explosion brought down part of the ceiling. Dan turned back to see Mike trapped under the debris. Their eyes met for one eternal moment. Go! Mike yelled. Get them out! The building was coming down around them. Dan had seconds to make an impossible choice. Try to save his best friend and likely lose everyone, or get the hostages to safety. He chose the mission. He always chose the mission. The memory released him back to the present, leaving him shaking and covered in cold sweat. Bear whined and licked his hand, bringing him back to reality. "I'm okay, boy," Dan murmured. "I'm okay." But he wasn't okay, because just then he smelled smoke. Dan burst out of his house to find his barn engulfed in flames. The fire painted the pre-dawn sky in hellish orange, and thick black smoke billowed into the air. Pinned to his front door with a hunting knife was a note. "Run away, Commander, or the next fire won't be so small." The sound of fire trucks filled the air as Dan fought to save what he could. By sunrise, his neighbors had gathered, the Thompson family, Greg Mitchell, old Mr. Chun, and others from the market. They formed a bucket brigade, helping the firefighters battle the blaze. "Dan, let us help," Marie pleaded as he worked to salvage what he could from the barn's ruins. "You don't have to face this alone. The more involved you get, the more danger you're in," Dan replied, his voice firm. "I won't risk anyone else getting hurt because of me. But, please," Dan cut her off, his eyes meeting hers. "I need you to trust me on this." After the crowd dispersed and the firefighters left, Dan stood in his yard, surveying the damage. The barn was a total loss, years of work reduced to ashes and charred timber. But as he watched Bear sniffing around the foundation, something clicked in his memory. He counted his steps carefully from the old oak tree, just as he had 3 years ago. 15 paces north, 23 east. The ground looked undisturbed, but Dan knew better. It took him an hour of digging to uncover the waterproof case he'd buried when he first bought the farm. Inside, wrapped in protective cloth, lay the tools of his former life: weapons, ammunition, tactical gear. He'd hidden them away, promising himself he'd never need them again. Now, as he ran his hands over the familiar shapes, he felt something shift inside him, like a sword being drawn from a too long sheath. The next morning at the market, Dan could feel the change in the air the moment the motorcycles approached. This time, Tyler walked straight to his stall, a smirk playing on his face. "Good morning, Commander Harrison," Tyler said loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "Or, do you prefer to be called sir?" Dan continued arranging his tomatoes, his movements unhurried. "Just Dan is fine." "Just Dan? That's funny." Tyler pulled out a stack of papers, waving them dramatically. "Because according to these, you're quite the American hero. Delta Force Commander, multiple combat tours, more medals than a Christmas tree. So tell me, Commander, what's a decorated warrior doing playing farmer? Hiding, maybe?" The market had gone silent, everyone watching the confrontation unfold. Dan finally looked up, meeting Tyler's gaze. "Not hiding," he said quietly. "Living." "Living?" Tyler laughed harshly. "Looks more like dying to me. The great Commander Harrison, getting fat and soft, letting punks like us push him around. Your dead teammates must be so proud." Dan moved then, so fast that Tyler stumbled backward. But instead of attacking, Dan simply picked up an overripe tomato that had fallen from his display. "You know what the thing about farming is, Tyler?" Dan's voice was conversational as he turned the tomato in his hands. "It teaches you patience. Everything has its season. It's time." Suddenly, Dan's arm moved in a blur. The tomato splattered against Tyler's chest, leaving a red stain that looked disturbingly like a bullet wound. Tyler looked down at it in shock while Dan continued speaking. "If that had been what you think I am, you wouldn't be standing here. Remember that." Tyler's face contorted with rage. He reached for Dan, but somehow his feet got tangled with Bear, who had silently positioned himself just so. Tyler went down hard, landing in a puddle of muddy water. The market erupted in poorly concealed laughter. Tyler scrambled to his feet, face red with humiliation. "You're dead," he screamed. "You hear me? Dead." As Tyler stormed off, Dan noticed a figure standing at the edge of the market, a tall, muscular man with graying temples and a military bearing. Their eyes met across the distance, and Dan felt his heart skip a beat. He knew that face. Later that evening, Dan sat on his porch with Eric Hammer Hayes, his former teammate and one of the few survivors from their unit. 2 beers sat unopened between them. "You should have called me," Eric said, breaking the silence. "The moment these boys started causing trouble." "It's not your fight, Hammer." "Like hell it's not." Eric leaned forward, his face intense. "I've been tracking the Steel Wolves for months. They're not just some random biker gang. They're organized, dangerous. They've been taking over small towns all across the state, using fear and violence to establish their own little kingdoms. Dan absorbed this information silently, watching the sun set over his damaged barn. Rachel reached out. He finally said. Eric nodded. She's the one who tipped me off about their interest in you. Dan, once these guys know who you are, what you can do, there's no going back. They'll keep coming until either you're dead or they are. I know. Dan's voice was heavy with resignation and determination. But this is my home now. These are my people. Then let me help. Let me call in the others. Whatever's left of the unit would come running. No. Dan stood up, his decision made. I didn't start this fight, Eric, but I'll finish it. My way. Eric studied his old commander for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Just like old times, then? No, Dan replied, finally opening his beer. Not like old times. This time, we're protecting something worth fighting for. The two men sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, each lost in their own thoughts. In the distance, crickets chirped their evening song, a peaceful counterpoint to the war drums beginning to beat in both men's hearts. Bear lay at Dan's feet, alert but relaxed, sensing that the pack was growing stronger. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. But tonight, for the first time in years, Dan felt truly awake. The soldier he'd tried to bury was clawing his way back to the surface, not to replace the farmer he'd become, but to stand alongside him. Because sometimes, the only way to protect peace is to remember how to wage war. And Dan remembered. God help him, he remembered everything. The steel wolves didn't come all at once. They trickled into town like poison seeping into a well, a few bikes at a time, spreading their influence street by street, business by business. Dan watched it happen from behind his produce stand, each day bringing new stories of intimidation and extortion. They're demanding protection money now, Martha whispered to him one morning, her hands trembling as she arranged her honey jars. Said if we don't pay, accidents might happen. Tom at the hardware store already gave them $500. Dan's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. How much did they ask from you? $300. I don't have that kind of money, Dan. Before he could respond, the rumble of motorcycles filled the air. Two bikers swaggered through the market, collecting their dues. Dan watched as they approached old Mr. Chin's stall, their leather vests gleaming in the morning sun. Payments due, old man, Snake Tattoo growled, his arm no longer in a sling, but still held carefully. Don't make us ask twice. Mr. Chin's hands shook as he opened his cash box. The bikers laughed, snatching bills and helping themselves to his vegetables. Dan's fingers curled into fists, but he forced himself to stay still. Direct confrontation would only make things worse. He'd learned that lesson in war. But the next day, the wolves crossed a line that made his blood boil. It started with the sound of breaking wood and Lily's terrified scream. Dan looked up to see three bikers systematically destroying the Thompsons' flower stall. They kicked over buckets of fresh flowers, smashed vases, and tore down the awning that Marie had hand-sewn. Guess you should have paid up, one biker sneered, grinding a bouquet of roses under his boot while Lily watched, tears streaming down her face. Please, Marie begged, holding her daughter close. Those flowers were for the Anderson funeral tomorrow. We need that money for rent. The bikers just laughed, continuing their destruction. Dan started forward, but Bear's low growl made him pause. More bikers had appeared at the market's entrance, including Tyler. This was deliberate. They were trying to provoke him into action. Instead, Dan walked calmly to where Lily stood crying. He knelt down beside her, his large frame blocking her view of the destruction. Hey there, sunshine, he said softly. Remember those sunflower seeds we planted? Lily nodded, hiccuping through her tears. Well, I checked them this morning. They're starting to sprout, little green shoots reaching for the sky. Would you like to see them? But our flowers. Lily gestured at the wreckage of their stall. We'll fix this, Dan promised, his voice carrying to where Marie stood. All of it. Sometimes things have to break before they can grow back stronger. That evening, Dan sat at his kitchen table reading a letter that had arrived that morning. The return address was from Karen Wilson, Mike Whiskey Wilson's widow. The paper trembled slightly in his large hands. Dear Dan, Michael used to say that you were the finest commander he'd ever served under, not because you were the strongest or the smartest, but because you never left anyone behind. He told me about Fallujah, how you carried that wounded civilian child 3 miles under heavy fire because everyone's someone's Lily. I know you blame yourself for his death. He wouldn't want that. What he would want is for you to remember what he died for, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The world still needs men like you, Dan, even if they don't wear uniforms anymore. Take care, Kara. Dan was still holding the letter when his phone rang. It was Greg's number, but Tyler's voice came through the speaker. Missing something, Commander? Dan's voice went cold. If you hurt him, shut up and listen. Tyler cut him off. Come to the old Miller warehouse. Alone, where your young friend here learns what real pain feels like. The line went dead. Dan stood perfectly still for a moment, then moved with sudden purpose. He walked to his bedroom closet and pulled out the gun case he'd retrieved from its hiding place. Inside lay his old tactical gear, cleaned and maintained out of habit rather than intention. As he checked his equipment, muscle memory took over. Each movement was precise, economical, like he'd never stopped being the man who wore this gear. He thought of Greg, young, idealistic Greg who'd stood up to the bikers when no one else would. The warehouse sat on the edge of town, a hulking shadow against the setting sun. Dan approached it like a ghost, years of training flowing back as naturally as breathing. The bikers had posted guards, but they were sloppy, overconfident. They never saw him slip past. Inside, he moved from shadow to shadow, listening to voices echo off concrete walls. He located Greg in a back office, tied to a chair with 2 guards playing cards nearby. It took less than a minute to neutralize them. A sleeper hold here, a precise strike there, and both men were unconscious before they knew what hit them. Dan, Greg whispered as Dan cut his bonds. How did you? Questions later, Dan murmured. Can you walk? They were almost at the exit when Tyler's voice boomed through the warehouse. Find them. Nobody leaves. Dan got Greg to safety just as the first shots rang out, the bikers firing wildly into the darkness. By the time they organized a proper search, Dan and Greg were long gone. The next morning, Tyler rode into town like a warlord, his entire gang behind him. He stood in the middle of the market, his face twisted with rage. Listen up, he roared. Your peaceful little town? It's over. We're going to burn every business, every home, every barn until there's nothing left. And it's all thanks to your friend the farmer. Dan watched from his stall, seeing the fear on people's faces. But he also saw something else. Anger, determination, the first sparks of resistance. Martha stood straight back behind her honey display. Old Mr. Chung gripped his garden hoe like a weapon, and Marie Thompson held Lily close, her eyes meeting Dan's with quiet strength. That's when Dan knew he couldn't protect them by staying separate from them. They needed to protect themselves. It started small. Dan invited a few trusted vendors to his farm that evening, teaching them basic self-defense moves in his barn. It's not about being stronger, he explained, demonstrating a simple wrist lock. It's about being smarter, working together. Word spread. More people came each night. Shopkeepers, farmers, even teenagers eager to help. Dan taught them what he could, adapting military tactics for civilian use. Martha turned out to have a talent for strategic thinking. Greg's computer skills helped them set up a warning system. Marie organized supply caches throughout town. During the day, Dan walked them through scenarios, showing them how to turn the market's layout to their advantage. Think like water, he told them. Flow around obstacles. Find a path of least resistance. They set up defensive positions disguised as ordinary market stalls. Old Mr. Chin's vegetable cart could become a barricade in seconds. The Thompsons' new flower stand had reinforced corners that could stop a motorcycle cold. Every vendor knew their role, their escape route, their fallback position. You're not soldiers, Dan reminded them. The goal isn't to fight. It's to protect each other, to make it too difficult for them to hurt anyone. One evening, as Dan was demonstrating how to turn everyday tools into defensive weapons, a familiar truck pulled up to his farm. Eric Hammer Hayes stepped out, followed by a truck full of supplies, radios, first aid kits, and other equipment that Dan recognized from their military days. Eric surveyed the scene, townspeople practicing moves in the yard, Martha directing a communications drill, Greg teaching others how to use the warning system on their phones. A slow smile spread across his face. Well, he said, walking up to Dan. Looks like the Delta Force is back in action. Dan shook his head, but he was smiling too. Not Delta Force. Just neighbors helping neighbors. Same thing, isn't it? Eric gestured at the practicing townspeople. A team is a team, whether they were uniforms or not. They watched as Lily, supervised by her mother, showed younger children how to duck and run if trouble started. The little girl caught Dan's eye and waved enthusiastically. Uncle Dan, look, I remembered the moves you showed me. Dan waved back, his heart both heavy and full. He'd tried so hard to leave the warrior behind, to be just a farmer. But maybe the two weren't so different after all. A farmer protects his crops, nurtures growth, fights against anything that would harm what he's growing. Sometimes that meant weather or pests. And sometimes it meant men like Tyler. Eric clapped him on the shoulder. They're ready, he said quietly. Question is, are you? Dan looked at his community, not just neighbors anymore, but a team, a family. He saw their determination, their courage, their trust in him and each other. He thought of Karen's letter, of Mike's sacrifice, of all the lessons he'd learned about protecting what matters. Yeah, he said finally. I'm ready. As the sun set over his farm, Dan watched his neighbors practice, prepare, and grow stronger. The steel wolves wanted to break them, but they'd forgotten something important. The strength of a community, like the strength of a soldier, isn't in its ability to destroy. It's in its ability to protect what it loves. And Dan loved these people, this town, this life he'd built. The wolves had no idea what they'd awakened, not just in him, but in everyone they'd tried to terrorize. A farmer knows that the strongest plants are the ones that bend in the storm but don't break. His town was ready. His people were ready. And somewhere in the darkness, Tyler and his gang were about to learn a very important lesson about underestimating quiet farmers who used to command elite fighting units. The breaking point had come and gone. Now it was time for the harvest. The steel wolves attacked just after midnight, their motorcycles roaring through the sleeping town like thunder. But this time, the town was ready. The first sign that something was wrong came when 3 bikes hit a carefully concealed oil slick at the market entrance. They went down hard, riders sprawling across the pavement. Before they could recover, nets dropped from the market's awnings, tangling them further. What the hell? Snake Tattoo shouted, swerving to avoid his fallen comrades. His bike hit a cleverly disguised rope stretched across the road, sending him flying into a pile of hay bales positioned exactly for that purpose. Dan watched from the roof of Martha's honey stand, using hand signals to coordinate the townspeople's response. Eric Hammer, Hayes maintained radio contact with teams positioned throughout the market. Team 2, they're headed your way. Eric's voice crackled over the radio. Remember the plan: contain and discourage. More bikes poured in, but each group found themselves facing obstacles they hadn't expected. Old Mr. Chin's cart accidentally rolled into their path. The Thompsons' reinforced flower stand blocked another route. Every turn led them into another trap, each one non-lethal, but increasingly frustrating. They're splitting up. Greg's voice came through the radio. He was monitoring the situation from his laptop, coordinating with lookouts around town. 3 headed toward Main Street. Martha, you're up, Dan commanded softly. Martha and her team were ready. As the bikers rounded the corner on a main street, they found themselves facing a wall of angry townspeople armed with fire hoses from the hardware store. The powerful jets of water sent the bikers tumbling. Their momentum turned against them. Tyler's voice rose above the chaos, filled with rage. Find them. Burn it all. But every attempt to start fires was met with immediate response. Fire extinguishers, buckets of water, and sand appeared as if by magic. The townspeople moved like they'd practiced, because they had, executing Dan's plans with precision born of preparation. Uncle Dan, help! The cry cut through the night like a knife, stopping Dan's heart. Through his binoculars, he saw Tyler dragging a struggling Lily toward his bike. Marie Thompson was being held back by 2 bikers, screaming her daughter's name. I've got your weak spot now, Commander, Tyler shouted into the darkness. Show yourself, or the girl dies. Dan's voice was ice cold as he keyed his radio. All teams, hold position. Eric, you have command. He stood up, ready to reveal himself, but Eric grabbed his arm. "It's a trap," Eric warned. "I know," Dan replied. "But it's Lily." The look they exchanged spoke volumes. Some things were worth walking into a trap for. "Then do it right," Eric said, releasing him. "Do it the old way." Dan nodded once, then disappeared into the shadows. The crowd below heard Tyler's shouts, saw him holding Lily on his bike, but no one saw Dan move. He simply vanished, becoming the ghost his Delta Force team had once been nicknamed for. The bikers had set up their camp at the abandoned drive-in theater on the edge of town. They'd positioned guards, set up floodlights, and created what they thought was an impregnable position. They were wrong. Dan moved through their defenses like mist through a fence. Years of training took over, every step silent, every movement precise. He noted guard positions, patrol patterns, blind spots. Most importantly, he saw Lily, tied up but unharmed, being watched by Snake Tattoo. The rescue itself took less than 2 minutes. A handful of pebbles thrown to create a distraction, a silent approach from behind, a precise nerve strike, and Snake Tattoo was unconscious before he hit the ground. Lily's eyes went wide when Dan materialized from the shadows, but she stayed quiet as he untied her. "Uncle Dan," she whispered as he lifted her into his arms. "I knew you'd come. Always sunshine," he murmured. "Close your eyes now. Don't open them until I say." Getting out was trickier than getting in, with Tyler now frantically searching for his leverage. But Dan hadn't survived 3 tours in Delta Force by being predictable. He used the old drive-in's drainage system, carrying Lily through concrete tunnels until they emerged well outside the biker's perimeter. He handed Lily to Eric, who was waiting with a car to take her to safety. "Get her to Marie, then get back here. This ends tonight." Tyler's scream of rage when he discovered Lily missing echoed across the drive-in. "Harrison, come face me like a man, you coward. Or are you only brave when you're sneaking around in the dark?" Dan stepped out into the floodlit area, his bulk casting a long shadow. "I'm here, Tyler." "You think you're so smart," Tyler snarled, stalking toward him. "Think you can make fools of us? Let's settle this. You and me, man to man." "No." Dan's voice was calm. "Go home, Tyler. You've lost. Don't make this worse." "Lost?" Tyler laughed maniacally. "I'm just getting started. After I beat you, I'm going to burn this town to the ground. Make all these people watch as their hero falls. Last chance," Dan warned. "Walk away." Tyler's response was to charge forward, throwing a wild punch at Dan's head. Dan stepped aside almost casually, letting Tyler's momentum carry him past. "Fighting angry makes you sloppy," Dan commented, still not raising his hands. "Makes you predictable." Tyler attacked again, a combination of punches and kicks that showed some training. But he was fighting a man who had spent decades mastering the art of combat, who had trained others to survive in the worst conditions imaginable. Dan moved like water, never where Tyler's strikes landed, always just out of reach. He didn't attack, simply let Tyler wear himself out against the air. "Fight back!" Tyler screamed, his face red with exertion and rage. "Fight me? Why?" Dan asked, sidestepping another rush. "What are you really fighting, Tyler? What are you trying to prove?" "Shut up." Tyler pulled a knife, the blade glinting in the floodlights. "Fight me for real." The knife changed things. Dan's expression shifted subtly, and suddenly, he wasn't the quiet farmer anymore. His stance changed, his presence became something else, something that made the watching bikers step back unconsciously. The fight that followed was brief, but intense. Tyler slashed and stabbed, each move met with precise blocks and deflections. Dan's movements were economical, each one serving multiple purposes: defending, positioning, wearing Tyler down. Finally, after a particularly wild slash, Dan moved inside Tyler's guard. His hand seemed to barely touch the biker leader, but suddenly Tyler was on his knees, the knife clattering away, his arm locked behind him at a painful angle. "You could have been something different," Dan said quietly, holding Tyler immobile with seemingly no effort. "Could have used your leadership to help people instead of hurting them. Could have built something instead of destroying it. Kill me then," Tyler spat. "Finish it." "No." Dan's voice was firm, but not unkind. "Killing is easy. Living with your choices, that's the hard part. I know something about that." He released Tyler, stepping back. You have a choice now. Same choice I had once. You can keep being what others expect you to be. Keep wreaking havoc because you think that's all you're good for. Or you can change. Can try to build something worthwhile. Tyler stayed on his knees, his whole body trembling. The silence stretched out, broken only by the sound of crickets in the darkness beyond the floodlights. Finally, Tyler looked up at Dan, and something had changed in his face. The rage was gone, replaced by something else. Confusion, shame, and maybe a tiny spark of hope. "Why?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Why show mercy?" "Because someone once showed mercy to me," Dan replied. "When I was lost in darkness after losing my men, when I thought violence was the only answer left. Sometimes mercy is the strongest move you can make." Tyler struggled to his feet, looking around at his gang, at the townspeople who had gathered to watch, at the market he'd tried to destroy. For the first time, he seemed to really see them, not as victims or targets, but as people. "Steel wolves," he called out, his voice carrying across the drive-in. "We're done here. Mount up." The bikers looked uncertain, but years of following Tyler's orders won out. One by one, they got on their bikes. Those who could. Some were still nursing injuries from the town's traps. As Tyler walked toward his motorcycle, he paused beside Dan. "This isn't how I thought it would end." "Endings are just new beginnings in disguise," Dan replied. "Choose your next one carefully." The sound of motorcycles filled the night one last time, but this time they were riding away. The townspeople began to cheer, the sound swelling as they realized it was really over. Lily broke free from her mother's grip and ran to Dan, wrapping her arms around his leg. "You did it, Uncle Dan. You saved us." Dan lifted her up, settling her on his shoulder like she weighed nothing. "No, sunshine. We all did it. Together." The crowd surrounded him then, Martha with tears in her eyes, old Mr. Chin bowing respectfully, Greg grinning from ear to ear. Eric stood at the edge of the group, a proud smile on his face. Marie Thompson made her way through the crowd, carrying something. "The sunflowers bloomed," she said, holding up a bright yellow flower. "Just like you said they would." Dan took the sunflower, looking at it thoughtfully. "Everything has its season," he said softly. "Even peace." The town celebrated late into the night, but Dan slipped away early, walking home with Bear by his side. The weight of his former life felt lighter somehow, as if by acknowledging it, by using it to protect rather than harm, he'd finally found the balance he'd been searching for. He wasn't just a farmer, wasn't just a soldier. He was both, and maybe that's exactly what his town had needed. Someone who knew both how to nurture and how to fight, how to build and how to defend. As he reached his front porch, he heard Lily's voice carrying across the night. "Uncle Dan, we're having pancakes at the market tomorrow, with honey from Martha." Dan smiled, scratching Bear behind the ears. "What do you think, boy? Pancakes sound good?" Bear's tail wagged enthusiastically. Tomorrow would be another market day. There would be vegetables to sell, stories to share, and pancakes to eat. The town would have some repairs to make, some healing to do, but they would do it together. And if trouble ever came again, well, they'd be ready. Not because they had a former Delta Force commander living among them, but because they had learned the greatest tactical advantage of all, the strength of a united community. Dan looked up at the stars, thinking of Mike and all the others he'd lost. "Hope I did right by you," he whispered to the night sky. "Hope I found the right way to keep fighting." A shooting star streaked across the sky, and Dan chose to take it as an answer. Sometimes the biggest victories come not from defeating your enemies, but from showing them a better way. And sometimes, the quietest farmers have the loudest impact. The morning after Tyler's defeat dawned bright and clear, but Dan's expression remained clouded as he addressed the gathered townspeople at the market. Bear sat alertly at his feet, matching his master's vigilance. "I know you're all feeling relieved," Dan said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "But this isn't over. Men like Tyler, organizations like the Steel Wolves, they don't take humiliation lightly." "But we beat them," someone called out. "They ran away." Dan shook his head slowly. "They retreated. There's a difference. We need to stay alert, keep our defenses ready." Martha stepped forward, holding a large honey-glazed ham. "At least let us thank you properly, Dan. We're planning a celebration dinner." "No celebrations." Dan cut her off, his voice gentle but firm. This isn't about thanks. It's about survival. The real fight might still be coming. The crowd murmured in disappointment, but they'd learned to trust Dan's instincts. As they dispersed, Eric approached, his military bearing obvious in his stance. "Want to do some recon?" he asked quietly. "I've got a bad feeling about those hills to the north." Dan nodded. They spent the next few hours scouting the countryside around town, moving with the silent efficiency of men who'd done this countless times before. They found evidence that troubled them both: tire tracks leading to hidden camping spots, fresh cigarette butts, signs of observation posts. "They're watching," Eric muttered, examining a recently abandoned lookout point. "Probably have been for days." Dan stood on a ridge overlooking the town, memories washing over him like a tide. Afghanistan, 2010, his last mission. The village was supposed to be safe. They'd swept it 3 times, confirmed no enemy presence. Dan had personally overseen the security arrangements for the civilian evacuation. "Looking good, Commander," Captain James Scout Cooper reported, his best friend since their first day of Delta Force training. "First convoy is ready to move." The families were loaded into trucks, women, children, elderly, all fleeing the advancing insurgents. Dan remembered a little girl waving to him from the back of a truck, reminding him so much of his niece back home. Then the world exploded. IEDs hidden in the road. Snipers in positions they'd cleared hours before. Someone had betrayed them, given away their plans. "Get those trucks moving," Dan shouted, returning fire as chaos erupted around them. "James, take Team 2 and—" The bullet caught James in the throat, cutting off his last words. Dan caught his friend as he fell, felt the life leaving him even as the battle raged. "Not again," Dan whispered, clutching James's body. "Not again." But he forced himself to let go, to lead, to get those civilians out. They saved 98 lives that day, lost 6 of their own. After that, Dan couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't lead men to their deaths. Couldn't bear the weight of command. A hand on his shoulder brought Dan back to the present. Eric stood there, understanding in his eyes. "You with me, Commander?" Before Dan could answer, they spotted an unfamiliar black sedan driving into town. They tracked it from their vantage point as it parked in front of the market. "That's not local," Eric observed. "No," Dan agreed. "Let's go say hello." They made it back to town in record time, arriving just as a tall man in a well-cut suit stepped out of the sedan. He was scanning the area with the practiced eye of law enforcement when Dan and Eric approached. "Daniel Harrison?" the man asked, showing a badge. "I'm Special Agent Marcus Carter, FBI. We need to talk." They gathered in Martha's coffee shop, which she'd closed early for privacy. Agent Carter spread photos across the table, surveillance shots of Tyler and his gang, but also of other, more organized-looking criminals. "The Steel Wolves aren't just some random motorcycle gang," Carter explained. "They're part of a larger organization we've been tracking for years. They move into small towns, establish control through intimidation, then use them as bases for drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, you name it." Dan studied the photos carefully. "And Tyler? Mid-level enforcer. His failure here." Carter gestured at the town outside. "It's not going to go over well with his bosses. They're already sending reinforcements." "How many?" Eric asked. "At least 50 riders, possibly more. Heavy weapons. These aren't just thugs on bikes. They're trained, organized, and they have something to prove." Dan absorbed this information silently, his farmer's hands tracing the edges of the photos. "How long have you been tracking them?" 3 years. We're building a RICO case, but bureaucracy moves slow. Search warrants, surveillance authorizations, jurisdictional issues." Carter sighed heavily. "By the time we get approval for a major operation, it could be too late for your town. So why tell us?" Dan asked, though he already knew the answer. "Because you've done what no one else has. You stood up to them and won. Maybe, with federal backing." Dan stood up, walking to the window. He watched Greg directing a group of younger residents as they reinforced market stalls with hidden steel plates. His own initiative after studying military fortification techniques online. "We can't wait for federal backing," Dan said finally. "These are our homes, our families. By the time your paperwork goes through, there might not be anything left to save." Carter nodded, unsurprised. "I thought you'd say that." Officially, I have to advise you to let law enforcement handle this. Unofficially, he slid a business card across the table. Keep me informed. And if things go sideways, I'm only an hour away. After Carter left, the town threw itself into preparations with renewed urgency. Dan's military experience, combined with the community's intimate knowledge of their town, created a formidable defensive network. The market became a fortress disguised as a farmer's market. Every entrance had multiple fallback positions. Children were taught safe routes home. Adults learned combat first aid. They stockpiled supplies, established communication networks, prepared for siege. Greg proved himself invaluable, applying his tech skills to their defense. He set up surveillance cameras disguised as market security systems, created a digital alert network, even rigged old smartphones as motion detectors around the town's perimeter. I never thought my gaming strategies would help in real life, he joked while showing Dan his early warning system. But I guess all those hours weren't wasted after all. Dan watched the younger man work, seeing shadows of James in his enthusiasm, his dedication. The thought both warmed and terrified him. That night, Dan and Eric sat on his porch, watching the stars emerge above the quiet town. Bear lay between them, alert even in rest. I can't lose them, Eric, Dan said quietly, voicing the fear he'd held inside all day. Not like we lost the others. These aren't soldiers, they're farmers, shopkeepers, kids. They're stronger than you think, Eric replied. You've taught them well, and they're not fighting for some mission or orders. They're fighting for their homes, their families. But if anything happens to them, if Lily or Greg, Dan's hands tightened on his chair arms. Hey, Eric's voice was firm. We've got this, Commander. We've got this together. They sat in companionable silence, two old warriors preparing for one more battle. Below them, the town slept, its people resting in the calm before the storm. But it wasn't the same town that Tyler had first terrorized. It was stronger now, united, ready. Dan thought of James, of all those he'd lost. Watch over us, he whispered to the stars. Help me protect them better than I protected you. A cool breeze carried the scent of his vegetable garden, mixed with the lingering sweetness of Martha's honey and the sharp smell of newly cut lumber from the market's reinforcements. This was what they were fighting for, not just survival, but a way of life. A community. In the distance, a dog barked, then fell silent. Bear's ears pricked up, but he didn't growl. Not yet. The storm was coming. But this time, Dan wasn't fighting to evacuate civilians or complete a mission. He was fighting for home, for family, for the life he'd built, and the people who'd become part of it. And this time, he wasn't alone. Get some rest, he told Eric. Tomorrow we do another perimeter check, run more drills. They're coming, and when they do, we'll be ready, Eric finished. Dan nodded, his expression set with quiet determination. The farmer and the soldier in him had finally found common ground. Both knew that the most precious things in life were worth fighting for, worth protecting. And both knew that the darkest hour comes just before dawn. They came at dawn, the thunder of motorcycles mixing with the first birdsong of the day. Dan stood on his porch, counting the waves of headlights cutting through the morning mist. Behind him, Bear growled low in his throat. At least 50 bikes, Eric reported through the radio. Heavy weapons visible. Tyler's in front, but there's someone new with him. Big guy, military bearing. Probably their reinforcements, Dan replied, his voice calm despite the tension in his shoulders. Everyone in position? Affirmative responses came in from around town. They'd been preparing for this, but the reality of seeing so many armed bikers was still chilling. The first strike came without warning, a series of explosions at the power station on the edge of town. The lights flickered and died as darkness crept back into the pre-dawn sky. Almost simultaneously, trucks appeared on the main roads, blocking access in and out of town. They're trying to isolate us, Dan observed, already moving. Martha, status on the backup generators? Running. Martha's voice crackled through the radio. Market Command Center has power. Mr. Chin's getting the secondary station online now. Dan had anticipated this move. They prepared independent power sources, hidden communication equipment, stockpiled supplies. But they needed more. Greg, you've got drone coverage? Yes, sir, Greg responded. They've got groups positioned here, and here. The town's shared tablet displays lit up with markers. Main force is holding back, probably waiting for us to panic. Dan organized the first patrol quickly. Himself, Eric, and 4 townspeople who'd shown particular aptitude during training. They moved through back alleys and secret paths, gathering essential supplies and checking on isolated residents. Remember, Dan briefed them as they moved, "We're not soldiers, and they're expecting us to act like scared civilians." Use that. The strategy proved vital when they encountered their first ambush. 3 bikers were waiting near the pharmacy, expecting to catch desperate townspeople seeking medical supplies. Dan's group approached exactly like frightened civilians would: obvious, noisy, seemingly disorganized. The bikers took the bait, stepping out with raised weapons and cruel grins. Well, one began, but that's all he got out. Dan's patrol moved with practiced precision. Martha's husband Tom, who'd been stumbling convincingly seconds before, dropped and rolled, sweeping one biker's legs. Eric and Dan took the other 2 down before they could react, using zip ties to secure them. "Check their radios," Dan ordered. "Greg, you getting this frequency?" "Already scanning," Greg confirmed. "Give me 10 minutes to crack their communications." They continued their patrol, securing resources and establishing supply lines between defensive positions. Each encounter with the bikers followed a similar pattern, the townspeople using their preparation and knowledge of the terrain to overcome superior numbers. Dan's phone buzzed. Agent Carter's message was brief. "Satellite shows another 30 bikes heading your way. ETA 2 hours. Federal response still pending. Stay alive." "Fat lot of good that does us," Eric muttered when Dan showed him the message. Before Dan could respond, all their radios crackled with an unfamiliar voice. "Attention, Commander Harrison and citizens of this pathetic little town. This is Tyler. By now you've noticed you're cut off. No power, no communications with the outside world, no escape." Dan motioned for Greg to trace the signal as Tyler continued. "I'm feeling generous, so here's the deal. Surrender now, hand over Harrison, and we'll only burn down half the town. Resist, and we'll burn it all, with you inside. You've got 1 hour to decide." The townspeople's radios erupted with chatter, but Dan's calm voice cut through. "Greg, get me on the frequency." A moment later, Dan spoke. "Tyler, you're making the same mistake you made before, underestimating what people will do to protect their homes." Tyler's laugh was harsh. "Still playing hero, Commander? Let me introduce you to someone. Rocco, say hello." A new voice came on, deep and professional. "Commander Harrison. Former Force Recon Marine here. Unlike these civilians you're hiding behind, I know exactly what you're capable of, and I know how to beat it." Dan's expression didn't change, but Eric saw his hands tighten on the radio. They both recognized the voice of a trained killer. "Everyone, gather at the market," Dan ordered on the town's frequency. "Time for some truth." 10 minutes later, Dan stood before his community in the market's command center. Faces looked back at him, scared but determined. Ordinary people who'd learned to be extraordinary. "They think we're weak because we're not soldiers," Dan began, his voice carrying to every corner. "Because we grow things instead of destroying them. Because we build instead of burn." He looked at each face in turn. "But that's exactly why we're strong." He moved among them as he spoke. "Soldiers fight because they're ordered to. We're fighting for our homes, our families, our way of life. Tyler and his men want to destroy what we've built, thinking it'll break us. But every seed we plant, every building we raise, every child we protect, these make us stronger than any biker gang." The market echoed with cheers and determined voices. Dan raised his hand for quiet. "They're coming. And yes, they're dangerous. But we've prepared. We know every inch of this town. Every alley, every rooftop, every hiding place. This is our home, and we're not giving it up." The attack began before the hour was up, bikes roaring in from multiple directions, trying to overwhelm their defenses. But Dan had planned for this. The first wave hit carefully concealed barriers, forcing them to bunch up. Pressure-triggered sprinklers activated, not with water, but with a mixture of oil and farm chemicals that made the road treacherously slick. Bikes went down, creating chaos. The second wave tried to flank through back streets, only to find them blocked by seemingly abandoned vehicles. When they tried to clear the path, hidden townspeople activated traps that had taken days to set up. Keep them scattered, Dan commanded through the radio. Don't let them concentrate their force. He and Eric led a counterattack from the market, using the confusion to pick off isolated groups of bikers. The townspeople moved with coordinated precision, using every trick Dan had taught them. But then Rocco entered the fight. He came out of nowhere, a mountain of a man moving with lethal grace. 2 townspeople went down before they knew what hit them, not seriously injured, but efficiently disabled. Amateur hours over, Rocco called out, stalking toward Dan. Time for the professionals. Dan handed his radio to Eric. Get those people to Martha for first aid. I'll handle this. Handle me? Rocco laughed, dropping into a fighting stance. I've studied you, Commander. Know all about Kandahar, Baghdad, that mess in Fallujah. You're good, but you're out of practice. Soft. I'm still sharp. Their fight was unlike anything the townspeople had seen. 2 highly trained warriors moving with deadly precision. Rocco was younger, faster, his techniques polished and powerful. But Dan had something else: experience, cunning, and the absolute certainty that he couldn't lose. Rocco launched a combination that would have ended most fighters, but Dan read it in his footwork, countered with a move that seemed to defy his size. The bigger man stumbled, surprise flickering across his face. That's not in any combat manual, he growled. No, Dan agreed, not even breathing hard. That's from 20 years of keeping young hot shots from destroying themselves. You're good, Rocco. But you've forgotten something important. Yeah? What's that? Dan's next move was pure Delta Force, a complex combination that ended with Rocco face down, his arm locked behind him. The best soldiers know when they're fighting for the wrong side. Looking into Rocco's eyes, Dan saw something familiar, the same lost look he'd seen in his own mirror years ago. There's more to life than violence, son. You can be better than this. For a moment, something flickered in Rocco's face. Doubt, recognition, maybe even hope. Then Tyler's voice screamed through the radio. Kill them all? Burn everything. The battle erupted with new intensity, but something had changed. The townspeople weren't fighting alone anymore. They were fighting as one, each person doing their part in a plan bigger than themselves. Dan helped Rocco to his feet. Your choice, Marine. Die for Tyler's ego, or help protect innocent people. Rocco looked around at the town, at the people fighting not for glory or power, but for their homes. His decision showed in his eyes before he spoke. Those Marines on your left flank? They're not real Marines. They'll break if you hit them hard enough. Dan nodded once, understanding the gift of information for what it was. Get out of here, son. Find a better path. As Rocco disappeared into the chaos of battle, Dan keyed his radio. Eric, take Team 2 and push left. They're not as tough as they look. The fight was far from over, but as Dan watched his community work together, Martha coordinating medical response, Greg running communications, every person doing their part, he knew they'd already won the most important battle. They'd proven that the strength of a community isn't measured in weapons or numbers, but in the bonds between its people. The sun was fully up now, revealing the scene in all its chaos. But where Tyler had expected to find a broken town, he instead faced a united force, standing stronger with every attack. Dan moved back into the fight, his bulk belying his grace, his farmer's hands dealing with threats as efficiently as they dealt with weeds. Around him, his community fought not just for survival, but for the future they believed in. The real war was just beginning, but they were ready. Today, they'd shown that even the smallest town could stand against tyranny when its people stood together. And somewhere in the battle, a former Force Recon Marine was rethinking everything he thought he knew about strength, about honor, about what it meant to be a warrior. The morning air filled with the sounds of conflict, but underneath it all, Dan could hear something else. The sound of his community rising, growing stronger, just like the crops in his fields. Some things, he knew, were worth fighting for. And some battles are won not by those who fight the hardest, but by those who fight for the right reasons. Tyler McCall stood atop the abandoned water tower, watching his forces regroup after their failed assault. His face was a mask of rage as he surveyed the damage. Dozens of bikes disabled, men nursing injuries, and still the town stood defiant. Behind him, his remaining lieutenants waited nervously. "Burn it," he snarled suddenly. "Burn all? I want this place wiped off the map." "But boss," Snake Tattoo protested, "some of our own men are still—" Tyler whirled on him, eyes wild. "Did I stutter? Get every fuel can, every torch, every damn match we have. I want this town to be ash by sunrise." In the market command center, the townspeople gathered to assess their situation. They were exhausted, scared, but there was something else in their faces. Pride, determination, the strength that comes from standing together. Martha bandaged a cut on old Mr. Chen's arm while reporting. "We're running low on medical supplies, but everyone's still able to fight." "Power grids holding on the backup generators," Greg added from his surveillance station. "But we've lost contact with the eastern sector." Dan listened to their reports, feeling every one of his years. They'd held out longer than anyone could have expected, but he could see the strain in their faces. Yet when he looked at them, Martha's steady hands, Mr. Chen's quiet dignity, Greg's unwavering focus, he saw not defeat but resolve. "We knew it would come to this," he told them. "They'll try to overwhelm us now. But remember—" His words were cut off by a burst of static from the radio, followed by Tyler's voice. "Hey, Commander, got someone here who wants to say hello." There was a sound of struggle, then Agent Carter's voice, strained but clear. "Harrison, don't—" A sharp crack cut off his words. "Warehouse District, 1 hour," Tyler continued. "You alone, or the Fed dies slow. And, just to make sure you're motivated." Multiple explosions rocked the town's outskirts. Through the command center's windows, they could see fires beginning to spread. "Clock's ticking, Commander," Tyler taunted. "How many more people have to suffer for your pride?" Dan's expression didn't change, but Eric saw the slight tightening around his eyes. They'd served together long enough for him to read his commander's mind. "It's a trap," Eric said quietly. "Of course it is." Dan checked his equipment with practiced efficiency. "But Carter's a good man, and we need the intel he has. Then we do this, right?" Eric turned to the group. "I need 4 volunteers. Fast, quiet, and crazy enough to follow us into hell." Hands went up immediately. Dan chose carefully. Tom from the hardware store, who'd proven surprisingly stealthy. Sarah from the coffee shop, a former gymnast who could move silently across any surface. And the Peterson twins, Jack and Jim, who communicated without words and knew the warehouse district better than anyone. "The rest of you," Dan addressed the remaining townspeople, "prepare for their assault. They'll hit hard, trying to divide our attention. Hold the line. Protect each other." Martha stepped forward, pressing something into Dan's hand. A jar of her honey. "For luck," she said simply. "Come back to us." The small rescue team moved through the shadows of the warehouse district, using every trick Dan had taught them. They found Carter being held in the old textile factory, guarded by 6 bikers who looked more professional than the usual gang members. "Mercenaries," Eric whispered, observing their positioning. "Ex-military, probably." Dan nodded. The stakes had just gone up. He outlined his plan using hand signals, each team member acknowledging their role. The rescue itself was a masterpiece of precision. Sarah created a distraction by dropping a chain of metal barrels from the upper level, while the Peterson twins approached from opposite directions, herding the guards into Tom and Eric's crossfire. They used non-lethal tactics, sleep darts, stun grenades, and precise pressure point strikes. Dan moved through the chaos like a shadow, reaching Carter's position undetected. But as he was cutting the agent's bonds, a sharp crack echoed through the warehouse. "Look out!" Carter shouted. Dan spun, shoving Carter aside as a bullet grazed his shoulder. He grunted in pain, but managed to get them both behind cover. "Sniper," he gritted out. "High position, northwest corner." Eric's voice came through their earpieces. "Got him. Extract now." They made it out, but not unscathed. Dan's shoulder wound, while not severe, bled steadily. Carter was bruised but mobile, and more importantly, he had critical information. "They've got enough explosives to level 3 towns," Carter reported as Martha bandaged Dan's shoulder. "Tyler's completely lost it. This isn't about control anymore. It's about destruction." Before they could process this, the night erupted with engine roars and war cries. The bikers launched their final assault, attacking from all directions at once. Their first wave overwhelmed the outer defensive positions through sheer numbers. Fall back to secondary positions, Dan ordered through the radio network, wincing as he shouldered his equipment. Initiate Protocol Delta. Protocol Delta was their last resort defense, a series of coordinated moves designed to channel attackers into prepared killing zones. But it required perfect timing and communication. Despite his injury, Dan took personal command of the Market Square defense. The townspeople moved with practiced precision, each person knowing their role in the complex defensive web they created. The battle was chaos incarnate. Bikes roared through the streets, met by improvised barriers and traps. Molotov cocktails thrown by the bikers were countered by fire extinguishers and pre-positioned water tanks. The town's defenders fought with the desperation of people protecting their homes, using every advantage Dan had taught them. Then Tyler appeared in the market square, standing atop an armored truck. He held a detonator in one hand, his face twisted with madness. "Enough games," he screamed. "Face me, Harrison, or I send this whole town sky high." Dan stepped into the open, his injured shoulder clearly visible. "It's over, Tyler. Look around you. You've already lost." "Lost?" Tyler laughed manically. "I lost the moment they sent me to this backwater piece of dirt. Do you know what this was supposed to be? A simple takeover. Quick, clean, professional. But you and your farmers and shopkeepers, you made me look weak. That's what this is about." Dan's voice carried across the square. "Your reputation? You don't understand. In my world, reputation is everything. I was somebody, a force to be feared. Now, I'm the guy who got beaten by a fat farmer and his pet townies." "You're right," Dan said calmly. "I don't understand, because in my world, reputation means nothing compared to doing what's right." Tyler's face contorted with rage. He threw aside the detonator, which Dan's team had already quietly disabled, and charged forward, pulling a wicked-looking knife. Despite his injury, Dan met him halfway. The fight that followed was brutal and direct. No fancy moves, no military precision, just two men locked in a primal struggle. Tyler had fury and desperation on his side, but Dan had something stronger. The quiet certainty of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he was fighting for. When Tyler lunged forward, blade flashing, Dan didn't dodge. Instead, he stepped into the attack, accepting a cut across his ribs to grab Tyler's wrist. In one smooth motion, he turned Tyler's momentum against him, sending them both to the ground. They rolled across the market square, neither man willing to yield. Tyler fought like a cornered animal, all technique abandoned in favor of savage desperation. But Dan's bulk, which Tyler had once mocked, now worked against the biker leader. Each time Tyler tried to escape, Dan's weight kept him pinned. Finally, Dan secured Tyler in an immobilizing hold, the knife lying useless inches away. "Do it," Tyler spat, blood and sweat mixing on his face. "Finish it. Show everyone what you really are." Dan looked around the market square. The fighting had stopped, everyone watching the scene unfold. He saw his neighbors, scared, brave, determined people who'd risked everything to defend their home. He saw the bikers, many looking uncertain, some already backing away. "Killing you won't undo the damage you've caused," Dan said quietly. "It won't heal what's broken, in this town or in you." He released Tyler, stepping back. "The police are coming. Agent Carter's backup is finally here. You have a choice: surrender now, help make this right, or run. Either way, your power over this town is finished." Tyler staggered to his feet, looking around wildly. His men were already dispersing, melting away into the night. In the distance, sirens could be heard approaching. The biker leader's shoulders slumped, the madness in his eyes fading into something closer to confusion. Without another word, he turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness. One by one, the remaining bikers followed suit, their motorcycles roaring into the night. Soon, only the townspeople remained in the market square. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Lily broke free from her mother's grip and ran to Dan, wrapping her arms around his leg. "We did it, Uncle Dan. We really did it." Her words broke the spell. Cheers erupted across the square, people hugging each other, crying, laughing. Martha started passing out honey jars. Old Mr. Chun produced tea from somewhere, and the Peterson twins began an impromptu victory dance. Dan stood in the middle of it all, one hand on Lily's shoulder, the other being bandaged by Marie. Bear pressed against his leg, tail wagging furiously. Eric approached, grinning. Not bad for a bunch of farmers and shopkeepers, Commander? Dan looked at his community, battered, exhausted, but undefeated. They'd faced down hardened criminals and won, not through superior force or violence, but through unity, intelligence, and sheer determination. Not bad at all, he agreed softly. Not bad at all. Agent Carter joined them, his suit dusty, but his expression satisfied. FBI teams are securing the area. We'll need statements, of course, but he looked around at the celebrating townspeople. I'd say this community has earned a few hours of peace first. As the sun began to rise over the market square, Dan felt the weight of command lifting from his shoulders. He was a farmer again, just a man who grew things and sold vegetables. But as he watched his neighbors helping each other clean up, sharing food and bandages and laughter, he realized something important. Sometimes the best way to fight darkness isn't with more darkness, but with the simple, stubborn light of ordinary people standing together. The town had changed, and so had he. The soldier and the farmer had finally found their balance, just as his community had found its strength. And somewhere in the distance, motorcycles roared into the dawn, carrying away men who'd learned a hard lesson about underestimating quiet farmers and the power of a united community. The morning after the final battle, the town awakened to a strange new silence. No motorcycle engines, no shouted threats, no tension in the air. Just the familiar sounds of birds greeting the dawn and the distant lowing of cattle in the fields. Dan stood in the market square, surveying the damage in the early light. Broken stalls, bullet holes in walls, scorch marks on the pavement, battle scars that told the story of their struggle. But already, the spirit of the community was shining through. Martha was sweeping broken glass from her honey stand, humming quietly. Old Mr. Chun and the Peterson twins were straightening bent support poles. Tom from the hardware store was already taking measurements for repairs, muttering about lumber and nails. You know, Eric said, appearing at Dan's side, most people would still be celebrating. Dan smiled, watching more townspeople emerge to join the cleanup effort. This is how they celebrate, by rebuilding together. The work continued through the day, everyone pitching in where they could. Children gathered scattered produce. Teenagers formed painting crews. Adults handled the heavy lifting. What might have taken weeks was accomplished in days through sheer determination and unity. Dan tried to work quietly, wanting to fade into the background. But he noticed how people kept finding excuses to thank him, to share a story, to express their gratitude. It made him uncomfortable, this attention, this respect that felt unearned. You're going to have to get used to it, Eric told him during a water break. You're not just the quiet farmer anymore. You're their hero. Before Dan could protest, Agent Carter approached, looking considerably more put together than he had during the battle. He carried a thick folder under his arm. The evidence we gathered here is incredible, Carter said, patting the folder. Bank records, communication logs, witness statements, everything we need to take down not just the Steel Wolves, but their entire network. Tyler's bosses are going to have a lot to answer for. What about Tyler? Dan asked quietly. Carter's expression turned grim. Still at large, but he won't get far. His own organization has disowned him. It's only a matter of time. And the town? Will they be safe? As safe as anywhere can be, Carter assured him. But something tells me they can handle themselves now. He extended his hand. Thank you, Commander Harrison, for everything. Dan shook the offered hand, noting how the agent used his military title with genuine respect rather than mockery. Later that afternoon, a small procession approached Dan as he was repairing his vegetable stand. Lily led the way, carrying something large wrapped in brown paper, with Marie and several other townspeople following. Uncle Dan, Lily announced formally, we made you something. The brown paper fell away to reveal a handmade quilt, its squares painted and embroidered with scenes from their struggle. The market, the farms, the townspeople standing together. Each patch had been crafted by a different family, their stories woven together into a single beautiful whole. Look, Lily pointed proudly. I did this one. Her square showed a large figure, clearly Dan, standing protectively over a group of smaller figures, with Bear at his side. Dan ran his fingers over the quilt, throat tight with emotion. He recognized Martha's careful stitching, Marie's artistic touch, even old Mr. Chen's traditional Chinese designs. It was more than a gift. It was a testament to their unity, their shared experience. The next morning, Dan rose before dawn. Bear watched curiously as his master dressed with unusual care, putting on his old military uniform for the first time in years. It still fit, though differently now, as farmers bulk, filling it out in new ways. The drive to the military cemetery took 2 hours. Dan had avoided this place for so long, carrying his guilt like a shield against memory. But now, standing before the graves of his fallen teammates, something had changed. "Hey, Mike," he said softly to Wilson's headstone. "Sorry I've been away so long. Had some things to figure out." He moved down the row, greeting each one. James Cooper, David Martinez, all the others he'd lost over the years. At each grave, he left a jar of Martha's honey and a fresh vegetable from his farm. "You'd laugh if you could see me now," he told them, "growing tomatoes instead of running missions. But I think I finally found what we were fighting for all along. A place worth protecting, people worth believing in." The sun was fully up when he finished, its warmth feeling like a benediction. For the first time in years, the weight of command, of responsibility, of guilt felt lighter. Back in town, changes were already taking shape. Greg had stepped up to organize the market's new security systems, applying his tech skills to protect rather than just survive. Young people listened to him with the same attention they'd once given Dan. "We're installing cameras," Greg explained excitedly when Dan returned. "But subtle ones, hidden in the decorative flowers Marie's designing. And I've got this app that connects all the vendors, lets them signal for help without being obvious." Dan listened, proud of how the young man had grown from an uncertain newcomer into a confident leader. Even bigger changes came when Eric announced his plans to stay. He'd bought the old gymnasium on Main Street, planning to convert it into a training center. "Not just self-defense," he explained to a gathered crowd. "Though we'll definitely cover that. But emergency preparedness, community response, everything we learned during the crisis. Next time trouble comes, we'll be ready before it starts." The town embraced the idea enthusiastically. Dan watched as his old friend began transforming from a warrior into a teacher, just as he had transformed from a soldier into a farmer. It was about a week later that the doubts began creeping in. Dan stood in his field, looking at his flourishing crops, and wondered if he was still needed here. The town had grown stronger, learned to protect itself. Maybe it was time to move on, find another quiet place to heal. He was loading boxes into his truck, Bear watching with concerned eyes, when Martha found him. "Going somewhere?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Thought it might be time," Dan said quietly. "Town's back on its feet. You don't need." "Daniel Harrison," Martha cut him off, hands on her hips. "If you think we're letting our protector walk away, you've got another thing coming." Before he could respond, more people appeared. Marie and Lily, Greg, the Peterson twins, old Mr. Chen, what seemed like half the town. "You're not just our protector," Marie said firmly. "You're family. Who's going to teach me to grow giant sunflowers?" Lily demanded. "And who's going to tell me when I'm overwatering my tomatoes?" Greg added. One by one, they shared what Dan meant to them, not as a warrior or a hero, but as a neighbor, a friend, a part of their community. By the time they finished, the boxes were back in his house, and Bear was wagging his tail happily. That night, Dan sat at his desk, writing in his journal. "Strange how life works. I came here looking for a place to hide from my past, to forget who I was. Instead, I found a place to heal, to remember who I could be. These people, they didn't just need protecting. They needed reminding of their own strength, their own courage. And in helping them find it, I found mine again. The soldier and the farmer aren't so different after all. Both nurture, both protect, both work to make tomorrow better than today. The town's scars will heal, just like mine have, and we'll be stronger for them. Mike, James, all of you, I think you'd be proud, not of the fighting, but of what we fought for. A community, a family, a home." The next morning dawned bright and clear. Market day. Dan loaded his truck with fresh vegetables, Bear taking his usual place in the passenger seat. The market square had been fully repaired, the bulletin board now displaying Greg's security protocols alongside Martha's honey prices and Marie's flower arrangements. As Dan set up his stall, he heard a familiar voice. "Uncle Dan, look what's blooming." Lily came running up, carrying a pot with a tall, bright sunflower reaching toward the sky. Her mother followed more slowly, carrying a tray of coffee cups from Sarah's cart. "Told you it would grow taller than you," Dan said, accepting a coffee with a smile. Around them, the market came to life. Martha was teaching Tom's teenage daughter the art of beekeeping. Eric was demonstrating a simple self-defense move to old Mr. Chun. Greg was showing a group of vendors how to use his new security app. Bear lay contentedly in a patch of sunshine, accepting pets from passing children. The morning air filled with the smell of coffee and fresh bread, the sound of friendly conversation and comfortable laughter. Dan looked around at his community, at the life he'd found when he stopped running from death. The soldier in him noted defensive positions and escape routes out of habit, but the farmer in him saw something else. Growth, renewal, the endless capacity of life to flourish after hardship. "Uncle Dan," Lily tugged at his sleeve. "Will you tell me the story about the sunflower seeds again?" Dan lifted her onto his usual produce crate, settling in to tell the tale. As he spoke, he caught Marie's knowing smile, saw the listening townspeople pretending not to listen. The market had changed, and so had he. But some things remained constant. The warmth of the sun, the richness of the soil, the strength found in standing together. Some things, like the seeds he'd planted with Lily, just needed time and care to grow into something beautiful. And in the end, that's what his story had really been about. Not the battles won or the enemies defeated, but the simple power of a community coming together, of people helping each other grow stronger, of finding hope in the darkest moments. Just like his vegetables, just like his sunflowers, just like the town itself, it was all about new beginnings. The fat farmer who turned out to be a Delta Force commander didn't just save a town. He reminded us that true strength often comes in unexpected packages. Dan Harrison's story proves that sometimes the quietest person in the room might be the most dangerous, and that the best warriors aren't always the ones who look the part. Which makes us wonder, how many heroes are walking among us, choosing to live quiet lives until the moment they're needed most? If you enjoyed this tale of hidden strength and community courage, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that remind us appearances can be deceiving, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the one you can see. It's the one your enemies never saw coming.